mocked as too big until he said, "Just right for my arms." Before we start the story, leave a comment telling us which city you're watching from. And at the end, don't forget to rate this story from 0 to 10. Enjoy the story. Dry Creek, Wyoming Territory, spring of 1883. The noon sun glared over the cracked earth, yet the air bit sharp like it held a grudge. At the center of town, a wooden platform stood like a gallows dressed for market. That was where Charlotte Hale stood, barefoot, wrists bound loosely before her chin lifted high, like she could will the sky to look back at her. 22 years old, tall as a doorframe and built like she could carry one, she stared into a crowd that stared back with open cruelty. "They'll need a team of mules just to pull her wedding wagon," a man chuckled from beneath a frayed hat. "She'd snap a bed like kindling," another muttered, earning a ripple of mean-spirited laughter. Charlotte's throat burned, not from the heat, but from the way each insult scraped down her like broken glass. Her family, what was left of it, had traded her to the auctioneer for flour lard and the promise they wouldn't starve through planting season. Too big, they'd said. "No man will marry you. Better you earn your keep than waste away here." Auctioneer Clive Morton strutted across the planks like a crowfat on carrion. "Strong as a draft horse, ladies and gentlemen," he barked. $50 to start." Silence. Dust swirled in the space where dignity used to live. Charlotte let her mind drift to winters when her father had laughed as she hauled split logs taller than her. "You're stronger than most boys," he used to say. "Don't you ever be ashamed of that." He'd died the year the farm failed. She'd learned since then how quickly admiration could curdle into shame. 40, Morton's snapped eyes flicking across the restless crowd. 30 then. "Come now. Look at those arms. She could carry water half a mile without stopping." Still no hands rose. "She'd eat more than 3 men," a woman scoffed, "and scare the devil clean back to hell." Charlotte's jaw locked. The rope bit red grooves into her skin. Humiliation roared behind her ribs. She would not let it spill onto her face. 25, Morton hissed at last. "Final offer." The crowd began to drift. Boots scuffed. Someone spat. Then came footsteps, measured, unhurried. They made the dust hush. A tall man in a weather-worn duster walked straight through the crowd's parting. His broad shoulders cast long shadows in the high sun. His boots struck the boards with the quiet weight of someone who feared nothing, not even silence. Elias Carter. The name rolled like low thunder through the murmurs. He was known, though barely seen, a cattleman who owned just enough land to be left alone and held just enough honor to never be questioned. He didn't drink, didn't brag, didn't lose. He stopped at the base of the platform, lifted his hat, and climbed the steps without asking. Charlotte braced for mockery. Instead, he slid one arm beneath her knees, the other behind her back, and lifted her clean off the sun-bleached boards like she weighed no more than a sack of feathers. Gasps cracked the air. Charlotte's breath caught hard. She should have struggled, but something in the steady way his arm held her made struggling seem foolish. Elias looked at the crowd. "She's just right," he said, voice soft yet carrying like a hammer on an anvil. "Just right for my arms." Silence dropped heavy as stone. No laughter followed as he carried her down the steps, through the stunned faces, and out into the glare of Main Street. Not until the wagon's creaking wheels had swallowed the square behind them did Charlotte dare to speak. "You didn't have to buy me," she said, her voice low, rough as a cracked bell. "Wasn't buying," Elias replied. "Just stopping a circus." Charlotte's cheeks flared. Is that what I was? Elias didn't answer. He only reached behind the bench seat and handed her a folded wool coat. For your wrists. She hesitated, then wrapped it around her shoulders. It smelled faintly of pine and saddle oil. I don't need pity. Good, Elias said. I don't offer it. They rode in silence. Not cold, just unfinished. The wagon rattled through red hills and gray-green sagebrush, the wind slipping like knives between the canyon teeth. Charlotte sat stiffly, trying to ignore the ache behind her ribs. Hours earlier, she had been sold like livestock. Now she sat beside a man who hadn't even looked at her like she was strange. She didn't know what she was here. Not yet. Twilight painted the canyon walls amber when Elias finally spoke. We're here. Charlotte blinked. Nestled deep between ridges lay a narrow valley. A house of pine and stone stood at its center, smoke curling from the chimney. Horses grazed behind a rough-hewn corral, their manes catching the dying light. The place felt quiet, secret, like the world had forgotten it, and maybe he wanted it that way. Inside the house was spare but clean. A rifle hung above the hearth. Shelves lined with well-used books. And on the mantel, a faded photograph of a young woman with windswept hair and laughing eyes. Charlotte paused. Your wife, Elias froze at the stove kettle in hand, was going to be. Lydia. What happened? 5 men ambushed us coming back from her mother's. Wanted my horses. His voice had gone thin and low like worn leather. She didn't make it. Charlotte's chest tightened. I'm sorry. She was small, he said after a pause. People said she wasn't made for ranch life, but she had fire. Wouldn't let anyone speak cruel without answering back. Charlotte stepped closer. You still love her. Elias nodded once. Some things stay even when the world leaves. Then why bring me here? He met her eyes. Because I saw something familiar. Not in your size, in your eyes. Her throat went tight. She looked away first. You're not a stray, he added quietly. Just someone the world misunderstood. So was I. Charlotte didn't know how to answer. No one had ever said something like that about her, not without a laugh behind it. That night she lay awake in the small guest room, listening to the quiet breathe around her. No shouting, no orders, just the crack of the fire down the hall and the distant snort of a horse. And for the first time since her father's farm, Charlotte felt not smaller for her strength, but just maybe safer for it. Charlotte rose before dawn each day, not out of ease, but habit. She fetched water from the pump split. Kindling swept the porch. Elias never asked. Doing kept her from thinking. He passed quietly, saddling his horse with a nod, before riding out to mend fences. The silence in the house wasn't cold, just vast. Every sound seemed to echo. By the third morning, she misjudged the front doorway. The frame clipped her forehead hard enough to sting her eyes. She kept walking, pretending it didn't throb. The next day, while she trimmed a horse's hoof outside, she heard sawing from inside. When she came in the doorway, stood 2 inches higher, fresh-cut pine smooth under her fingers. Caught my hat on it, Elias said, casually walking by with a shovel on his shoulder. Charlotte hesitated, then murmured, Thank you. About time the house fit both of us, he replied, and left her blinking at the doorway. A few days later, a new chair appeared at the table, sturdy oak, wide-seated, braced to hold real weight. It didn't creak when she sat. No one had ever made space for her before. They'd only made room around her like she was an obstacle. Space felt different. Space meant intention. When Elias asked if she wanted to ride along to town, she almost said no. Town meant eyes and eyes meant mouths. But hiding was its own kind of prison. All right, she said. Dry Creek looked smaller from the wagon bench, yet the stairs hadn't shrunk. In the saloon, while Elias ordered coffee and sarsaparilla mutters rose from the smoke. Barn door with boots, someone snickered. Bet she breaks the bed frame. A red-faced ranch hand staggered toward her. "Hey, big girl," he slurred, reaching for her wrist. Before she could react, Elias had the man's hand in a grip like iron. His voice stayed level. "You'll take that hand back and you'll keep walking," the man yelped, cradling his wrist as he stumbled for the door. Silence rippled through the room. Not fear, respect, the kind reserved for storms that never miss. Outside, she said, "You didn't have to do that." "Yes," Elias answered simply. "I did." Later at the leather shop, 3 women watched Charlotte like hawks. "Married yet, or just playing house for acreage?" one asked sweetly. "Bless him, man's spine must be hickory," another murmured. Charlotte's boot caught a step. The leather bundle slipped from her arms. Their laughter was soft but sharp. Boot steps. Elias knelt, brushed off the strap, and placed it gently back in her arms. Then he turned, voice calm but cutting clean through the air. "These are not hands for shame. They're hands that build, hands that save." Silence flattened their smiles. Elias only looked at Charlotte and said, "Ready." She nodded. No laughter followed them this time. Back at the ranch, Charlotte went to sort tools in the storage shed. Dust lay thick on old gear. Behind a crate, she found a roll of parchment blueprints. New paddocks, irrigation lines, fences. In the margins, notes marked with initials she didn't know. One symbol matched the red square with R she'd seen on crates near the east fence. Red Rock Holdings. She carried the papers inside. Elias sat at the table, drawing his knife across a whetstone in quiet, steady strokes. "Who's Samuel Rourke?" she asked. The blade paused mid-slide. He set knife and stone aside. "Man who tried to buy this land 10 years ago. When I said no, he tried other ways." Charlotte glanced at the photo of the laughing woman on the mantel. "Lydia." She turned down his proposal, Elias said flatly. "Barn caught fire 3 months later. Sheriff called it lightning. There wasn't a cloud within 20 miles. Charlotte felt the room shrink. "You think he did it?" "I know he did." She looked down at the blueprints. "Did you bring me here to fight him, or because I could stand where she stood?" Elias met her eyes. He took his time. Maybe at first he admitted, "I saw someone strong enough to hold the gate when the wind leans hard." He paused. "But that's not what I see now." "What do you see?" Her voice came out small. "Not a shadow," he said. "Not a weapon. I see a woman the world tried to make smaller and failed." Charlotte swallowed hard. Rope burns had faded to pale ridges on her hands, but they still looked like her hands. For the first time in years, that felt like enough. That evening, they ate by lamplight. He offered the last biscuit. She refused. He only nodded. Nothing grand. But the quiet between them had shifted just a fraction, like a door cracked open to let in air. The wind carried whispers faster than wagons could roll. By the time Charlotte returned to town with Elias the following week, Dry Creek had already decided what she was. "Beast," someone muttered from a mercantile doorway. "Built like a barn, and twice as mean," another said, not even bothering to lower his voice. Charlotte kept her head high, eyes straight ahead, though each word scraped across her like grit under her skin. She had worked dawn to dusk for days, mending fences, trimming hooves, clearing dry brush from the creek bed. But to the town she would always be the girl, sold on a platform, too much of everything, except what they wanted. It worsened outside the fabric store. A cluster of finely dressed women stood on the boardwalk, their parasols tilted like spears. You married yet one asked sweetly, or just playing house for acreage? Another smirked. Poor man, must have lost his mind. Charlotte's boots felt suddenly clumsy. The parcel of leather straps slipped from her arms and thudded on the boards. The women's laughter was small and sharp. Then silence. Elias had stepped between them, his shadow cut in the sun. He knelt, picked up the bundle, brushed it off like it was something precious, and set it gently back into Charlotte's arms. Then he turned to the women, voice calm but carrying. "These are not hands for shame," he said, nodding toward Charlotte. "They're hands that build, hands that save." The laughter died like snuffed wicks. No one replied. Elias looked at Charlotte. Ready, she knotted her throat tight. They walked away. This time no whispers followed. Yet gossip traveled faster behind their backs. Within days it grew teeth. People claimed she brought misfortune, that Elias only kept her because she was strong as a mule or because he wanted her to guard the land. Some even said she was cursed. Charlotte pretended not to hear, but she felt how the street shifted around her when they walked together. Conversations stilled. Mothers drew their children closer. Fear had its own gravity. She didn't need Elias to tell her whose hand pushed at Randall Boone, Samuel Rourke's trail boss. Boone had a smile like a knife's glint, and enough money to make fear seem like sense. He had failed to buy Elias's land, failed to tarnish his reputation, and now seemed determined to scorch anything he couldn't control. That night, Charlotte stood outside the barn, arms folded tight. The moon lit the hills in pale silver. She had just finished shaping an iron horseshoe. Its heat still shimmered in her memory. Elias's footsteps crunched the gravel behind her. "You're thinking about leaving," he said quietly. Charlotte didn't turn. "If I go, he'll stop stirring the town against you. Fires die when they run out of fuel." "No," Elias said. "They just burn someone else." She had no answer. The next afternoon, a small tug at her apron hem pulled her from her thoughts. Abby stood there, 7 years old, Braid's wild face smudged with dust. She was the blacksmith's daughter, all elbows and fierce eyes. "I heard them," Abby whispered, "saying you might leave." Charlotte crouched down. "Maybe it's for the best." "No," Abby said with more fire than her small frame should have held. "If you leave, they win, and I lose. You're the only person who makes me feel safe." The words struck harder than the women's mockery ever had. For most of her life, Charlotte had been told she was too much, too big, too loud, too strong. To Abby, she wasn't too much. She was enough. That night the flames came. Charlotte woke to the sharp stink of smoke. Through the barn window, shadows moved 5, maybe 6 men, tearing down fences, spooking the horses. She bolted barefoot into the cold night, grabbing a pitchfork. Heart hammering, she flung the stable gate open just as the terrified herd slammed against the walls, eyes rolling white. "Easy," she whispered, arms spread wide. "It's all right. I'm not letting them touch you." A figure lunged from the shadows. Before he reached her, another figure crashed into him from the side, Elias. Then more shapes appeared from the dark. Townsfolk. Not the ones who had whispered or laughed earlier that day, but the blacksmith, the miller's wife, even the storekeeper, all with tools in their hands and fear in their eyes, but not fear of her. Fear for her. The night exploded into chaos. Men shouted fists, flew, boots thudded on packed dirt. The horses screamed, but didn't bolt. Charlotte stood rooted like an oak, shielding them. Elias fought silent and fierce, every motion sharp as a drawn blade. One of Boone's men cracked under a spade handle and scrambled off into the dark. The others followed, fleeing into the hills. Then silence. Dust drifted in the cold moonlight like snow. Charlotte stood still, sweat streaking her face, hair wild around her shoulders. Elias stepped toward her shirt, torn cheek, bruised eyes locked only on her. Without a word, he wrapped his arms around her tight, sure, warm. Then he turned to the crowd. "She's not too big," Elias said loudly, steady as bedrock. "She's the reason we're still standing." No one laughed. Someone, maybe Abby's father, nodded. Another man removed his hat. A woman stepped forward and touched Charlotte's arm gently, respectfully. Something shifted then, not just in Charlotte or Elias, but in the town itself. The air no longer crackled with suspicion, only with the aftershock of fear melting into awe. The fire had been beaten back, the horses, save the fences, wrecked but repairable. And the woman they'd called a beast had stood unshaken at the center of the storm. As the townsfolk drifted home through the settling dust, Charlotte stood in the yard, pitchfork still in her hand. For the first time since she had stepped off the auction block, she saw no fear in their eyes. Only respect, quiet, wondering, like they had just witnessed something sacred. The next blow didn't come in the dark, it came under the bright rafters of the town chapel. Word spread that the council had called a public meeting. By dusk, the pews overflowed. Farmers with dust in their boots, merchants with ink on their fingers, and those who had once mocked Charlotte now sat shoulder to shoulder, their murmurs rising to the rafters. At the front stood Randall Boone, boots polished, vest pressed sharp as a blade. His smile was slick as lamp oil. "I warned you," Randall said, voice pitched to Carrie. "I warned you what would happen if we let a monster take root among us." Gasps and whispers rippled through the pews. Charlotte sat near the back beside Elias, shoulders squared. Randall's gaze cut toward her like a whip. This woman, he sneered, was bought like cattle, and now she threatens our children and our livelihoods. You call it strength, I call it corruption. Charlotte rose slowly. Her boots echoed on the wooden floor as she walked the center aisle. Murmurs swelled. She didn't hurry. She carried something in her hand, not to menace, but to remind. A woodcutter's axe, its blade dulled from honest work. She climbed the dais and turned to the room, voice steady. "If being strong is a crime," she said, "then I am guilty." Silence sharpened. "But don't forget, strength built your barns after the flood. Strength hauled your wagons out of the mud. Strength carved this town out of stone and dust." She lifted the axe slightly. "This chopped the firewood that warmed your schoolhouse. It repaired the fence that kept your cattle in. And last week it stood between your children and chaos." She looked straight at Randall. "You call me a monster. I say you're afraid not of me, but of the idea that someone like me doesn't need your permission to be worth something." No one breathed. Then an old woman stood. She nodded once, firmly. A farmer rose next, then the school teacher. One by one, the townsfolk stood. No cheers, no applause, just quiet defiance. Randall's smile faltered, the mask slipping just enough to show the teeth behind it. Charlotte stepped down, not triumphant, just unafraid. She had spoken, and the town had listened. But Randall was not finished. The dry season had turned every blade of grass brittle. Even the air smelled like tinder waiting for a spark. 3 nights after the meeting, Elias burst through the door, eyes sharp. "South field's burning," he said. "Ridge is glowing." Charlotte was already on her feet. "Bucket," she said, grabbing her boots. "Wake the neighbors." The bell at the chapel began tolling, a sound used only for death or disaster. Tonight it was both. By the time they reached the ridge, the south field was a wall of fire. Flames clawed at the sky wind, shoving them toward the barns and beyond them the town. The heat hit like a furnace door. "We need a brake line," Elias shouted. Charlotte scanned the yard. Behind the barn loomed an old livestock wall 30 feet long, thick with rotten termites. "If we pull that down, it'll block the fire's path." "It'd take 10 men, Elias yelled back. Charlotte didn't answer. She was already moving. She gripped the first post. Muscles surged like drawn bowstrings. With a roar, she wrenched. Wood shrieked, split gave. A beam toppled. She seized the next. Men around her froze, watching her tear the wall apart piece by piece. The structure groaned like some dying beast, and then with one final heave, the whole thing crashed to the ground in a thunderous clap that rattled the earth. The fire struck the fallen wall and faltered. Flames split, swirling, losing strength. Buckets of water followed, passed hand to hand. Shouted names and curses tangled in the smoke. Men and women who had once called her cursed now worked shoulder to shoulder with her, soaked in sweat and ash, until the last spark hissed into steam at their boots. Then there was only the crackle of cooling wood and the ragged pull of lungs. Charlotte stood, chest-heaving, hair plastered to her face with sweat. Soot streaked her arms. A broken timber still hung from her grip. One man stepped forward, the same rancher whose fence she'd once mended in silence. "You saved my barn," he said. Another voice rose. "Mine too. My daughter was in the house behind that barn," someone said hoarsely. "You saved her." The crowd swelled toward her, not with jeers this time, but with thanks. Elias moved through them until he reached her. He took her soot-streaked hand, the one still gripping the broken beam, and raised it. "She's not too big," he said, voice steady. "She's the reason we're still standing." No one laughed. Instead, heads turned toward Randall Boone, who sat on his horse near the road, flanked by only a few remaining men. "Didn't even bring a bucket," someone muttered. "Just watched," said another. Randall's mouth tightened. He turned his horse sharply and rode into the dark. This time, no one followed. Charlotte stood amid the wreckage, the night air cooling around her like quenching iron. Only hours earlier, they had watched her like a threat. Now they watched her like a miracle. The field still smoked, the fence was gone, but the barn still stood, and so did she. Autumn came soft and golden, as if the land itself wanted to forget the fire. Dry Creek held its annual harvest festival in the town square, lanterns swaying above tables of pies and pumpkins fiddles, playing quick tunes while children chased each other with sticky fingers. Charlotte had heard of the festival before, always from a distance, never as someone welcome to attend. Now she stood at the center of it, unsure where to put her hands. People didn't avoid her gaze this time. They sought it. They smiled, nodded, clapped her shoulder as they passed. The same mouths that once whispered "too big" now said "good to see you" or "glad you made it." It felt unreal, like stepping into someone else's dream. The mayor climbed a makeshift stage of wagon planks and called for quiet. "Miss Charlotte Hale," he said, voice carrying over the crowd. "Would you come up here?" Charlotte froze. Her palms went clammy. Then she felt a touch at her back, Elias's hand, steady and warm. "You earned this," he said softly. She drew a breath and stepped forward. The crowd parted. No laughter followed, only the sound of clapping, slow at first, then building. When she reached the stage, the mayor took her hand. Once he said, "Some saw your strength as strange. Now we see it for what it truly is, a gift. This year's harvest isn't just about grain and fruit. It's about who kept the ground beneath us from burning. Please accept our thanks." The applause rose into a cheer. Charlotte blinked hard against the sting in her eyes. For a long time she had braced herself for blows. She hadn't learned how to stand still for praise. Then Elias stepped up beside her. In his hand was a silver arm cuff, delicately engraved, polished smooth by years. His voice was low but carried clearly. "My mother wore this. She gave it to my sister, and when she passed I kept it thinking I'd never find someone strong enough to wear it. Not strong in arms, but in spirit." He turned to her, eyes steady. "You were never too big. You were always just right for this land, for this life, and for me." The square hushed. Elias slipped the cuff over her wrist. The silver caught the lantern light, but it was the warmth in his gaze that held her still. Someone shouted about time, and laughter rippled, not cruel this time, but bright and full of joy. The cheer rose like a wave. Charlotte smiled. Not the polite, tight smile she used to wear to keep people comfortable. This smile was unguarded, wide, and real. Elias offered his arm. She took it. They stepped down from the stage together, and the crowd swelled around them, not as an audience, but as a community. Women beckoned her to the pie table. Men clapped her shoulder. Children darted to her side, asking about the fire, the horses, the wall she had pulled down. No one said too big. No one said not like us. They said, "You belong here." And for the first time, Charlotte believed them. As dusk deepened into night, the fiddles played faster. Lanterns glowed like fireflies over the square. Charlotte stood by the fire pit, the silver cuff warm against her skin, when a small hand tugged hers. Abby, cider sticky and grinning. "Will you dance with me?" Charlotte laughed softly. "I'm not much of a dancer." "You pulled down a whole wall," Elias said, leaning close with a half smile. "I think you can handle a few steps." So she took Abby's hand, and then she took Elias's. They joined the ring of dancers, awkward at first, then laughing as they missed steps and spun too wide. The crowd joined, boots thudding the board skirts, flaring, children shrieking in delight. Laughter rang into the stars. Charlotte looked around the faces, the lights, the land she now helped protect. She was no longer the girl sold on a platform, weighed and measured like livestock. She was a woman who had built something with her own scarred, strong hands, a home, a life, and at last freedom. Under western stars, beside the man who saw her as just right, Charlotte found more than survival. She found belonging. And if her story speaks to you, if you've ever been told you were too much for the world, remember this: the world doesn't get to decide your worth. Belonging isn't about shrinking to fit people's comfort. It's about standing tall as who you are until the right people make space around you. If you've ever stood your ground against doubt, share your story in the comments. And if you want more tales of grit, heart, and redemption like Charlotte, subscribe, because more journeys like hers are waiting down the trail.